A case for early voting in New York State. According to a study conducted by the Pew Research Center, Americans consider the following to be the top 5 essential rights and freedoms that define America: freedom of speech, the right to vote, the right to privacy, freedom of religion, and the right to bear arms. This study showed that 91% of Americans consider the right to vote as essential to their own personal sense of freedom. That same study found that 57% of independent voters, as well as both Democrats and Republicans, believe that it should be easier for Americans to vote. In the November 2016 election, New York had the 8th worst voter turnout, with only 57% of voters actually turning out to vote. Voter turnout is generally lower in all states in non-presidential election years, but in New York it is abysmal. In the 2014 midterm elections, New York voter turnout dipped to just 34.4%, ranking New York at 48th in the nation for voter turnout that year. These turnout rates are not anomalies. New York has ranked in the bottom half of states for voter turnout in all but one election during the last 2 decades, and barely more than half of voters regularly take part in each statewide election. This failure is largely driven by outdated laws that make it harder for New Yorkers to vote. One such law restricts New Yorkers to casting their ballots only on Election Day. A study conducted by the Siena Research Institute found that 65% of New Yorkers believe that New York State should institute early voting similar to that which exists in dozens of other states. So, what is early voting? Early voting is when states allow people to cast their ballots in person prior to Election Day without requiring an excuse. Currently, 37 other states and Washington, D.C. allow their residents to vote early. Typically, states establish a limited number of polling sites throughout each county where voters can cast their ballots for usually up to 1 week prior to Election Day. Most states also include at least one weekend day in their early voting period. To give you a better understanding of why New York should join the majority of the nation and institute early voting, let's take a look at Louisiana. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Louisiana has approximately 3.5 million eligible voters, compared to New York, which has approximately 15.5 million eligible voters. Though New York's eligible voter population is roughly 4 times the size of Louisiana's, Louisiana residents have more than 4 times the number of voting hours offered to New Yorkers. Given New York's vast voter population, along with the state's fast-paced culture, 1 day of voting is simply not enough time. According to Diana Kasdan of the Brennan Center for Justice, the benefits of early voting include greater access to voting, increased voter satisfaction, shorter lines on Election Day, improved poll worker performance, and early identification and correction of errors and system glitches. With early voting, if an error in a voter's registration record can be fixed during the early voting period, it may mean the difference between a vote that counts and disenfranchisement by mistake. Early voting has been shown to increase access to voters from all walks of life. Specifically, early voting increases access to the polls for single parents, the elderly, students, people with disabilities, and working people, specifically those who have long commutes, who cannot take time off of work, or those who work multiple jobs. Unfortunately, early voting was one of the many progressive reforms to be cut from the 2019 fiscal budget, but that does not mean that New Yorkers will never enjoy the benefits of early voting. If this is something you would like to see instituted in New York, then contact your representatives. You can also reach out to your local League of Women Voters and ask how you can join the fight to bring early voting to New York State.